Okay, shalom everybody. Today we'll continue with the laws of Eruvin, of mixing and merging the domains to be like a private domain. And so we learned in chapter 21 about the difference between the public domain and the private domain, but just as a reminder, the term that kept appearing is called TZURAT PETACH. So in the old days, the wait, let me do this diagram first because it's better. In the old days, there was a road, a public road, next to a very small neighborhood, and the small neighborhood could be even maybe 10 houses. In those days, it was usually round, actually, not square. And in the middle of this courtyard would be a public cistern for people to use for drinking and cooking. Um, and they would also close the gate, as we learned last week, for Shabbat, and that way nobody can come in from the outside without being invited. And that was important to make sure that this is actually a chatzer that is now collectively shared by the people that live in the houses in that courtyard. And so this is just another diagram where instead of actual wall or gates, there's this thing above it to connect it. And so today we do it with a string instead of um, with a wooden beam. And because of one of the greater community's concerns about should we have an Eruv, shouldn't we have an Eruv, is the Eruv kosher, etc. Communities have fallen apart because of it, but I'm still looking for the story about that child that brought peace to the courtyard. And so Rabbi Dr. Hu wrote a book copying a little bit from Dr. Seuss, and it's called Red Eruv, Blue Eruv, Tall Eruv, No Eruv. And so with that introduction, let's try to understand how we make this Eruv. So we have learned that according to most poskim, today's streets are considered a Carmelit, which means a rabbinic public domain. Thus, to permit carrying in the streets, it is sufficient to surround them with structures resembling doorways, tzurat petach, which form a kind of wall around them. So we said even a wired fence or any kind of something that shows that there's separation between us and the people or the things on the other side. And most of the communities in Israel, for sure, are surrounded by a fence because for security reasons. And so we're not aware of it here in North America so much. But instead of having a fence, especially with large cities, we have these poles that create a resemblance of a gateway. We said that they have to be at least 10 tfachim high, which is approximately 3 feet, maybe 3.5 feet, and also that they have to be no wider than 10 amot, which is approximately 15 feet, because that would make it, sorry, 10 amot is yeah, 15 feet, because then it's not recognizable that this is actually a gateway or a doorway. So the basic form of a doorway is comprised of two doorposts with a lintel atop them, like we saw in that diagram. A lintel can be formed by laying a board across the top of two posts or running a string above the posts. The main requirement for a tzurat petach is for the posts on the sides and the string or wire above them to be configured like a doorway. Since the lowest doorway is 10 tfachim high, with the poles of a tzurat petach must be at least that height, and that high to be considered valid for an eruv. The wire extended above them must also be at least 10 tfachim above the ground. Accordingly, if any part of the eruv droops lower than that, meaning they didn't stretch it strong, they didn't tighten it enough, or for other reasons, then it makes the entire area between the poles considered breach, since there is no actual doorway in which any part of the lintel is lower than 10 tvachim. And Rabbi Brander, many years ago, taught us about a drawbridge over a river, and basically said that the only solution is to have a separate eruv for each side of the river, and not rely on it, because it might open sporadically, and then you don't know if you're carrying in the public domain, and suddenly you don't have a kosher eruv anymore, and so what are you going to do? And also, if the poles are more than 10 amot, approximately 15 feet away from each other, the entire eruv is disqualified as a breach of 10 amot, disqualifies an eruv. Since the poles from the sides of the TZURAT PETACH, they must be strong enough that a normal wind would not cause them to sway and to support some type of door, even if only an extremely light one made of straw. That's how strong they have to be. According to most poskim, there is no limit to how wide a TZURAT PETACH may be, as it can retain the basic form of a doorway even if it extends for 1,000 amot. However, Rambam maintains that when most of the Eruv's perimeter is comprised of TZURAT PETACH, no TZURAT PETACH may extend longer than 10 amot. L'chatchila, when possible, his opinion should be taken into consideration. As far as I know, the Shulchan Aruch also passed in that way, and so did Rav Mordechai Eliyahu and Rav Ovadia Yosef. Even though they had all kinds of disagreements about other things, this is one of those basic things that the chief rabbinate of Israel required very strict format for how to do Torah Petach. But like I said before, in smaller settlements where there's a fence around it, that's already sufficient. You just have to remember that the gate that comes into the Yishuv has to be closed on Shabbat, which it is, even if it opens for an emergency vehicle, that is okay, and that's why I'm mentioning it. And last but not least, we talked last week about how besides the TZURAT PETACH, we must also lay food, which is enough for 2 meals, in case somebody wanted to eat it, to prove that we are actually part of the same private domain, or semi-private. However, in practice, since it is very difficult to enclose towns and cities using TZURAT PETACH that are limited to 10 amot, we are lenient and do not limit the width of a TZURAT PETACH. And then it's completely outside of the city, not more than, I think, 1,000 amot, 1,500 feet from the last house. And then it's very obvious that those strings and poles that we see are holding this kind of TZURAT PETACH. The wire that is stretched between the tops of the poles must be secured well enough that it will not become detached in a normal wind. Lechatchila, when possible, it should be stretched taut so that it will not even sway in the wind or droop down below the tops of the posts, since lintels do not normally sway or droop if they were actual pieces of wood. However, b'diavad, even if the wire sways or droops, the eruv is kosher. So we'll stop here and open up for questions.